folks, my name's Lisa. Welcome to my channel. Today I will be showing you the easiest seed stitch pattern for beginners, and you will learn how to knit the seed stitch pattern in no time. The seed stitch is a common easy stitch pattern in knitting. It's made by alternating knit stitches and purl stitches within a row and between rows. It's called the seed stitch because the stitches create little bumps like these that you can see here, and they look like seeds. It's identical on the front side and the back side, and this is a common choice of stitch to use for things like borders on sweaters or hats. It's great for edges because often if you're doing something like just a stockinette stitch of knitting on one side and purling on the other side, it creates a curl on the edge of your fabric, but the seed stitch helps prevent your project from curling. And this could be knit with straight needles or circular needles. And I have two swatches here. Here's the swatch made with a medium weight yarn, and it gives this kind of look, which is great for hats, borders, sweaters, cute baby clothes maybe. But I also knit it in a thicker yarn, and it gives such a different look. This can create something like a blanket or some great throw pillows. But look at the difference of what the same stitch looks like, just with a different thickness of yarn. The seed stitch pattern consists of 2 rows and 2 stitches. You can knit the stitch with an even or an odd number of stitches cast on. Here I've cast on 17 stitches, and I'll show you first how to knit the seed stitch with an odd number of stitches. So we're going to pretend this is the first row, and we're going to knit the first stitch, purl the second stitch, and then repeat that sequence to the end of the row. So I'm knitting, purl, knit, purl, and I'm just going to continue, knit, purl, and we'll do this until the end of the row. And at first you might have to remind yourself that you're going to knit, next purl, next knit, next purl, but soon you'll have muscle memory and you won't even be thinking about it, you'll just be doing it because you've conditioned yourself to knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl for the row. Okay, I've completed the first row. Now the second row, because it's an odd number of stitches, is going to be identical to the first row. That means when I turn the needle over to start my new row, I'm going to start my first stitch with a knit stitch. The reason the second row is the same as the first row when knitting with an odd number of cast on stitches is because you're going to be always knitting into the purl stitches and purling into the knit stitches. So when I turned this row over to the second row, my first stitch that I see here has a bump. That bump indicates that it's a purl stitch. So that means that my first stitch must be a knit stitch because the seed stitch is essentially knitting the opposite stitch for every stitch that appears. So for this I have a bump for the first stitch, which means I must knit a knit stitch for that stitch. The second one shows a V. I hope you can see that. It's right there. That indicates it's a knit stitch, and because it's a knit stitch there, I'm going to need to purl that stitch for the new stitch. Hopefully that's not too confusing. So for the second row, I'm going to do as the first row and start with my knit, then purl, and continue that repetition throughout the row. So let's do our second row. And when you're knitting, and if you lose track of whether you knit the last stitch or purl the last stitch, remember, you're knitting opposite of what the stitch to be knit is. So for instance, I'm coming up to my next stitch here, and I see there's that bump. That means that was a purl stitch that was knit on this stitch for the last row. So the new stitch has to be the opposite, so it's going to be a knit stitch. Then I look at this next stitch, and I see those straight lines, which would create a V, and that means that last stitch in the previous row was a knit stitch. So in this row, for that stitch, I must do the opposite and knit a purl stitch. So regardless of whether you are keeping track of whether it's knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, or which row, just remember you're knitting into the opposite of the stitch that's on the needle. And if you keep that in mind, you'll create the seed stitch. All right. And there you have it, the seed stitch. Now, if I was going to be knitting the seed stitch with a project that had an even number of stitches, what I would do is I would be knitting the first row as a knit and purl, and if you also notice, I'm knitting with a circular needle, and I'm still knitting the project flat. This is just a preference that I use, a circular needle for all my projects. I prefer to use it. It's especially good if you travel a lot, as I do, and I like to have the circular needle for traveling because I won't lose a needle in transit. And then if I have a pattern that calls for both circular and flat knitting, I can use the circular needle for both techniques, and it just saves me from carrying more equipment or losing it. So on the first row of this swatch, I started with a knit and then purl and knit and purl throughout the entire row. And then when I turned it over, because it's an even number of stitches, I can't start this row with a knit stitch because the first stitch right here shows that it's a knit stitch and I need to knit the opposite. So for row 2 of an even number of cast on stitches for the seed stitch, you start with purl, and you purl, then knit, purl, knit throughout the row. If you're knitting the seed stitch in the round with circular needles, the same rules apply to knitting with an odd number of cast on stitches or an even number of cast on stitches. Just be sure to have a place marker for the beginning and end of the row. So if you have an odd number of stitches, you're just going to be continuing to knit and purl, knit and purl, knit and purl throughout the rounds. And the place marker is good just to indicate a new row is beginning. But it's more important to have that marker for when you have an even number of stitches when knitting the seed stitch in the round, because when you get to the end of the row of the seed stitch on a circular needle with even number of stitches, you need to change the sequence for the next row. So every other row is going to be changed just as you would when you're knitting flat, where row 1 and row 2 for even number of stitches are different, but row 1 and row 2 of odd number of stitches are the same. And there you have it. We have the seed stitch finished in a medium weight yarn and a thick yarn. Both very nice, simple stitch to create. I hope this tutorial will help you on your next project that involves the seed stitch knitting pattern. It's a very nice pattern to knit. It gives a nice, homey, cozy looking results. And let me know in the comments what you will be knitting with this pattern. I'd love to see what you make. And if this video has helped you, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to help me grow my channel. I really appreciate you watching, and I hope you learned something today. And thanks for watching. Bye.